Hello and welcome back to another video. I'm so excited to share with you today the 20 books that I read in Q1 of 2025. Now that my first couple of videos are out, I wanted to kind of backtrack a little bit and play catch up with you guys so that I could share with you the books that I read in January, February, and March of this year. You will have hopefully already seen my April recap. Hopefully you'll enjoy the books that I share with you today as well. So for today's video, I'm going to give you a brief summary, a quick review, and my star rating for each one of the books that I read in Q1 of 2025. Without further ado, let's get started with book number 1. The very first book that I read this year was actually a reread. It was Apprentice to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mayer. Because it was a reread and because it is the second book in a series, I don't want to delve too deep into the summary of this book, but essentially we are following Evie Sage and Tristan Maverine, who are our dynamic duo in this series. As you can guess by the title, we are talking about the assistant or the apprentice now in book 2 and the villain. This book is a cozy and whimsical take on the standard fairy tale story of the evil villain versus the innocent villagers or the innocent kingdom. We have a so-called benevolent king who is ruling the kingdom of Renadon, and the evil villain who lives in his mansion or lair. In book 1, he comes across Evie Sage and decides to hire her as his assistant, and it's a pretty ridiculous story with very silly characters and storylines and inner monologues for each character. I absolutely love this story and Hannah Nicole Mayer's writing. It's so whimsical and fun. It's just a fun and easy read when you want some silly, wholesome laughs. I rated this book 3 stars. I did kind of feel that it fell into the curse of the sequel, or whatever you want to call it, where Book 1 held up really strongly and was an absolute delight, and Book 2 kind of had a hard time meeting the same expectations. I find that this happens often in sequels or the second book in a series where the plot gets a little muddled and there's points in the story that drag or don't necessarily make sense. A bit of a meandering plot, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. There was a little bit of that in Apprentice to the Villain. However, it was still very enjoyable, and my favorite character, Kingsley, continued to make us laugh in the second book. Next, we have The Midnight Feast by Lucy Foley. This story takes place during the opening weekend of a new resort and spa and reveals a mysterious set of characters playing different roles throughout our story. This is a multiple POV story where each chapter takes you through the experience of a different character throughout the story. You're also kind of jumping back in time to reveal different backstories to each character. And throughout the book, you discover that not all are who they claim to be. The present day story kind of propels you towards a big catastrophic event that takes place at the very end of the book, which you have a hint of knowing at the very beginning. So it's a bit of a whodunit kind of mystery thriller. Lucy Foley has found a formula that works for her and has run with it. And to be honest, I respect it. There's something kind of comforting about coming back to the same author in a new book, in a new story, knowing that you're going to be taken along for a ride, knowing that you're going to be asking yourself multiple questions about each character, not sure which character to trust throughout the book. It's nothing groundbreaking at this point because I've read quite a few of her novels. However, I enjoy the writing, I enjoy the characters that she builds, I really enjoy the settings that she builds for us, and overall I feel that I can always depend on her to deliver a little thrill and a cast of really questionable characters each time. I gave The Midnight Feast 3 stars. Next, we have one of my favorite reads so far this year, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries by Heather Fawcett. In case you haven't jumped on the bandwagon and picked up this story, you're following Cambridge professor Emily Wilde as she arrives in a remote and quaint little town to continue her research on fairy life. so that she can complete her encyclopedia, which she is putting together as part of her work at Cambridge. As a little bit of a no-nonsense academic type, Emily has a rather difficult time building relationships with the human inhabitants of the village that she is visiting until her colleague Wendell Bamblebee arrives to offer his unsolicited support in her work. As her total opposite in personality, Wendell uses his charm and charisma to help Emily build these relationships and gain the support of the villagers so that she can further advance her work and her research, which comes in handy when she gets into a bit of a pickle of her own as she dives deeper into the world of fairy magic and fairy lore. I gave Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries 4.5 stars. This book was an absolute delight to read. It is the definition of a cozy fantasy. The language is whimsical and fun, while at the same time not feeling too young in its prose. I felt that Emily was a very mature character, and although Wendell is a bit of a silly goose sometimes, he still also felt like a mature counterpart. And perhaps my favorite is that it felt like a different and refreshing take on the standard kind of romantasy tale where you have, you know, your basic tropes of your female main character and your basic tropes of her male love interest. Emily is a bit the complete opposite to what you usually find in those types of stories. She's curmudgeonly, she's stiff, and has a bit of a stuck-up attitude towards others. She's not very relatable, and she often kind of misses things that might seem more obvious because she is so wrapped up in her work. And so it's an absolute delight to see her be so passionate about the work that she does and often miss some things that as an audience you're picking up on in her relationship with Wendell Bamblebee. It's so cute, it's so fun, and I really enjoyed also the way that Heather Fawcett writes it, almost like an epistolary novel, because you are getting some letters and some exchange between Wendell and Emily, though mostly you're kind of getting her perspective as she's writing her journal that she's using to build her encyclopedia. It's very cool. The fourth book that I read in January was Dinner for Vampires by Bethany Joy Lenz. Shifting away from fiction, Dinner for Vampires is a memoir told from One Tree Hill star Bethany Joy Lenz, who played Haley James Scott. I was a huge fan of the show back in the day, and of course, when I saw that she released this book, I felt very interested in learning more about her story. In this book, Bethany Joy Lenz writes about how she found her way onto the hit TV show that everyone knows and loves. She writes about how her upbringing built her understanding of the world and the actions and events that led to her ending up in a cult and in an abusive marriage. I gave Dinner for Vampires Life on a Cult TV show 4 stars. This book was extremely reflective and emotional, at times rather dark. I really enjoyed the writing in this book. The way that Bethany Joy Lenz tells her story feels like watching color film negative slides telling her story. It's very nostalgic and ethereal. She's very honest about her experience and the pain that it's caused her, while not falling into the victim storyline. She very much owns her experience in a way that is dignified and empowering, and I found that very moving. The way that she writes felt filled with self-love and acceptance. So while you're reading these dark and emotional stories, it feels very soft because you know that she's telling it from this point in her life where she has found peace and made peace with the things that have happened to her. I'll do books 5 and 7 together since they are a duology by Carissa Broadbent, and those 2 books are The Serpent and the Wings of Night and The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King. These 2 books are a duology, part of a bigger series called the Crowns of Nyaxia series. In book 1, you're following Araya, the adopted human daughter of the Vampire King. Araya has just entered the Kajari tournament, in hopes of winning the tournament and thus winning a wish to be granted by Nyaxia, the goddess of death herself. Though Araya has been trained by her father, the Vampire King, from a young age, because she is the only human in the tournament, she is forced to ally with Rain in order to advance throughout the tournament, though she can't fully trust him, and that of course causes friction in their relationship, which threatens their survival in the tournament. As she makes her way through the tournament, Araya learns more about herself and some truths that her father has kept from her throughout her life. In book 2, you're following Araya after the Kajari tournament as she tries to pick up the pieces of her life that have kind of ended up in chaos. I rated both of these books 2 stars. I don't have a whole lot to say about them. It's a pretty cookie cutter romantasy vampire story. It's full of a lot of the common tropes that you might find in this genre, such as enemies to lovers, the unlikely but somehow stunningly beautiful female main character, the chosen one. You have, of course, the tournament, vampire bloodlust. If you are somebody who enjoys reading romantasy for the predictable tropes, these books will scratch that itch for you. They're pretty predictable. If you've read any of these types of romantasy books, you've read this story. So I would say if this is what you're into, then go ahead and read this book. If you're looking for a more serious, more complex story, that's not what you're going to get with one of these stories. Sandwiched in between the 2 Crowns of Nyaxia books was the big release that we were all waiting for in January, which was Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yarros. If you've been living under a rock for the last few years and you have no idea what I'm talking about, Onyx Storm is book number 3 in the Empyrean series, following books 1 and 2, Fourth Wing and Iron Flame. In book number 3, Violet and co go on an adventure to find allies in the ongoing war against, spoiler alert, the Venin that they are fighting. While she and her cohort are on a mission to find said allies, Violet is on her own separate private mission to find a solution for a big problem that she has and continue to keep a very big secret from her close friends and loved ones. I rated Onyx Storm 2.5 stars. I don't know what to say about this book. I did not want to read Fourth Wing for a very, very long time, and eventually I caved in because I felt like, because I didn't want to be a hater just for the sake of being a hater. I wanted to give the book a chance. The book delivered exactly, unfortunately, what I expected it to, which was a lot that I won't get into in this video because we'll be here for a very long time. I've continued to read this series because I am curious about the story. I also love when there is kind of like a movement of people who are just very excited about a book. It feels very nostalgic to other times when we had similar reactions to books like these. As far as my review of Onyx Storm, I felt that 1, the book was way too long. Mood-wise, it felt like 2 different books where I'm not sure that the first book of this book needed to be written or needed to be as long. The plot definitely meandered and got lost at times. It dragged at times. So that's not anything that's too different, I think, from the first 2 books. And the other thing that I don't think is very different from the first 2 books is that Violet and Xaden continue to have the same frustratingly annoying dynamic where there's this like push and pull. The drama and the conflict that they are experiencing in their relationship is very much the same issue that they've been having in the last 2 books. And the reason why that's frustrating is because it doesn't feel very mature and doesn't show a lot of character development or character growth, where the book leads you to believe that there has been a level of growth. However, the actions, the dynamic, the conflict does not reflect that in reality. This book, of course, also ends on a big cliffhanger, just like the first 2 books. And I found myself very irritated by this because at this point it feels like we're just doing it for the social media buzz and for the fans to like clown and spiral about theories. So it feels more like a marketing tactic than it does an actual like useful plot device. And I hate that. I really don't like that. The reason why it doesn't feel like a successful plot device is because there's too many holes that don't make it a strong enough cliffhanger. I don't know how else to describe that without getting like too far into it. I would have to do a separate video, and I don't know that I care enough to give this series a whole video. Let me know down below if that's something that you want, but I'm not here to be a hater, and this is not a series that I appreciate too much. So I don't really want to make a video where it's like a lot of negative feedback on a story that a lot of people really love. And I have no judgment on if you love this book or this series. I think it's delightful that we have this period of time that feels very nostalgic for especially my generation, where folks are so excited about a book again that we're having midnight release parties and all this like merch. And I'm really happy to see that the bookish trend in general has just taken off. So I don't want to sit here and talk negatively about a book that brings a lot of people joy, to be honest. The last book that I read in January was Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. In 1978 Florida, a man breaks into a sorority house and brutally murders women in their sleep. There is a number of survivors that are left traumatized due to the violence of this act. This story follows one of those survivors and the key witness in this attack, Pamela, as she navigates the misogyny and the absurdity of the criminal justice system and the media coverage of this time period. She ultimately joins forces with another woman who is the surviving partner of one of this perpetrator's previous victims. Together they work to uncover the truth behind some of the mysterious police fumbles and work to ultimately bring him to justice. So I did not know anything about this book going into it. I did not know that this was a historical fiction. I did not know that this had anything to do with the Ted Bundy cases. I had no context going into this book. So I started reading it, and a few pages in, I'm like, oh, this is about Ted Bundy. And I don't know that I would have picked this book up if I had known what it was about. I think what I find most interesting and frustrating is that based on what I've read, the reason why Jessica Knoll picked the topic of her story is because she had probably the same reaction many of us did to the sudden like onslaught of coverage that we got in Netflix and other network documentaries and film adaptations of the Ted Bundy trial and his criminal timeline. Like many of us, I think she felt disgust at the continued idolization and the perpetual image of Ted Bundy as this like star, which is gross, of course. What I find kind of ironic is that I think in writing this book, she continues to do that. Of course, her attempt was to do the opposite in giving voice to the fictionalized victims or survivors of his crimes. One of the most intentional things that she does is she never names him. So throughout the story, you never anywhere on the text see the words Ted Bundy. He is always referred to as the perpetrator. I believe that was a deliberate choice to make a point about the lack of relevance of his name and to kind of subvert the image that we have of him as Ted Bundy, right? The focus was to be on the women in this story and their perspective. What I took issue with is that it's a fictionalized telling of these perspectives of women that A, did not exist, and B, written by a woman who didn't know the women who were impacted or just didn't have anything to do with them. I believe that Jessica Knoll's history is, I think she used to be a reporter, and so I think that she has that mind that is curious about digging up the story. So I appreciate where she was coming from in her approach. However, the story felt a bit trauma porny at times and made me uncomfortable in that I didn't understand why it needed to be written. I think a better answer to the question that she's posing would have been to do a story like one that I'm gonna talk about later, Barracoon, where you're interviewing the actual person who experienced the traumatic event and writing their story word for word, as opposed to this like fictionalized telling, which feels a bit disrespectful. It's not the right word. I don't know. I've had trouble voicing my feelings about this book since I've read it, but I think ultimately the two big qualms that I had with it is that the main female character that we follow, Pamela, her voice did not feel very authentic to me, to a woman who would have had that experience, and it did not feel empowering. At times I actually felt like the voice that she gave her further added to the problem with the characterization of the Ted Bundy trial of the time. And the second big issue that I had with her is that the language itself, the writing, felt very try-hard. So there were multiple times where I was reading and a certain word would pop up and I was like, why would you, like the diction was crazy. It was at times unnecessarily complicated, and the actual prose felt very try-hard in that there was a lot of telling instead of showing. So there were times where I felt like Jessica Knoll was talking directly to me as the reader via the character Pamela as proxy, just to kind of like rant on her soapbox a bit about the misogyny or the injustice of the trial or the social climate of the time. And while I don't disagree, I don't like reading books like that because I never want to feel preached to in a story. I'd just rather form my own thoughts and conclusions about what I'm reading than be told, even if it's an opinion that I have or that I agree with. It's just not something that I respond to well as a reader or just as a person in general. So I gave Bright Young Women 2 stars. So those were the 8 books that I read in January. Now on to February. The first book that I read in February was From Here to the Great Unknown, a memoir by Lisa Marie Presley and her daughter Riley Keough. In 2022, Lisa Marie Presley approached her daughter Riley for her help in finishing her memoir that she'd been struggling to finish writing. 1 month after asking her for that help, she passed away. This story covers Lisa Marie's upbringing at Graceland, her troubled adolescent years following the tragic death of her father, Elvis, and the trauma that she battled for years after. While Riley does help in finishing her mother's story, she does include bits of her own grief and her own experience for the losses that she's faced in her family, which included her mother and her brother. I gave this book 4.5 stars. This book was so deeply moving, so reflective, so incredibly sad. The way that both Lisa Marie and Riley explore their experiences of grief at the loss of a parent, in Lisa Marie's case, the loss of her father Elvis, and in Riley's case, not only the loss of her mother Lisa Marie, but the loss of her brother Ben. The way that it explores grief is just, it's so honest and beautiful in a painful and melancholy way. There's layers of generational trauma. None of it feels romanticized. It all feels very raw and honest and truthful to the two women who write this story. I had so many notes in the margins of this story because I was so moved and related to so many aspects of it. Aspects about mother-daughter relationships, about the experience of watching a loved one struggle with addiction, about the effects of unresolved and untreated trauma. It was so well done, and I'm really grateful that Riley made the decision to finish the book. Shifting gears, the next book that I read in February was Graveyard Shift by M.L. Rio. Every night, a motley crew of students, workers, residents of this university campus meet up at the graveyard in the center of campus to smoke a cigarette. One night, they meet up and find that there is a mysterious open grave with no planned funeral or service on that day. And so they go on a hunt to solve the mystery. I gave Graveyard Shift 2 stars. To be honest, I don't understand the purpose of this book. I thought the setting was really rich. ML Rio's writing is great, but the plot went nowhere. And that was really frustrating because I was looking forward to the book, and by the end I was very confused about where it was supposed to go or what the purpose was. Third, in February, I picked up Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. Please ignore the hideous sticker that I still need to remove. So Opal is working hard and fighting to get her little brother out of the town of Eden, Kentucky, where they currently live. Financially, they are struggling, though she has big hopes and aspirations for her little brother, who is in high school, to gain acceptance into a prestigious prep school so that he can get out of Eden. One day she gets the opportunity to potentially make that happen for her little brother, but it comes at a cost. She has to take a job at Starling House, which is the very mysterious and spooky manor in town, owned and inhabited by its sole resident, Arthur Starling. As she works to clean up and bring Starling House back to life, she uncovers some rather dark and unsettling truths, not only about the past of Starling House, but her own past and the truth behind her mother's death. I rated Starling House 3.5 stars. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. If you liked Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia or books like it, I would say this is a book that you would also enjoy. I found it very similar in tone, the same kind of gothic, eerie setting. Generally, the story was pretty solid. There were some very good bones. And I think the only reason I gave it a lower rating than perhaps what I originally wanted to is that the writing at times did feel more YA than it did adult for me. There were also a bit of dips or lulls in the plot at times. But overall, it was a great time. I would reread this book, and I would recommend it if you enjoy these types of fantasy novels. Book number 4 in February was Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo by Zora Neale Hurston. In 1927, Zora Neale Hurston traveled to Alabama to interview 86-year-old Cujo Lewis, who was the last living person who was captured as a slave in Africa and was brought over on the last slave ship, the Clotilda. Zora Neale Hurston transcribes Cujo's story as she hears it, while including bits of her visits with him, and ultimately showing the impact of trauma left behind, even decades later. I gave Barracoon 5 stars. Told in Cujo's own vernacular, his own voice, with a touch of Hurston's presence, you really feel as though you are sitting at that kitchen table with Cujo, with Zora, listening to him tell this story, watching him have these visceral reactions as he gets to some of the darkest and most harrowing parts of his experience. What captured me most about this work is the masterful way in which Zora pays tribute to Cujo's story, honoring his experience, only including parts of her in ways that are effective to propelling the story and showing us the impact of the trauma. She shares pieces of her interactions when she's visiting him, the moods that he's in on different days, the way that he speaks to her when he suddenly abruptly wants to stop talking about something that's particularly dark. And it's incredibly impactful and important that she does include those pieces of the story. I mean, it's so well done. And what I found the most amazing is that this story was published posthumously in 2018, almost 100 years after the day that she originally began to collect the material for it. The main reason why this book was not published during her lifetime is because Zora refused to change Cujo's voice. She was repeatedly pressured by publishers who did show interest in the book to change his voice to proper English, and she refused. And thus the story was never published in her lifetime, which is awful, but so incredible that she held that much respect for Cujo, for telling his story in its most authentic way. I just admire her as an anthropologist, as a storyteller so much. It's amazing. I think everyone should read this story, certainly everyone who lives in this country, because it's such a deeply important part of our history that we all need to hear. The 5th book that I read in February was 1984 by George Orwell. In case you are not familiar with this classic, we are following Winston Smith. He is feeling a tremendous amount of frustration with the oppressive control of the party in Oceania. Winston meets a woman named Julia, with whom he begins a secret affair before joining the Brotherhood, which is the secret group working to overthrow the party. With Big Brother watching everywhere, Winston and Julia have to be extremely careful every time that they meet and with the work that they do with the Brotherhood, else they be caught and tortured by the party for disobeying the rules. This was a reread for me. Of course, this is a 5-star book. I wish that I had not reread it. In the current climate, it was a very difficult read for me and was triggering a lot of anxiety. So I do not recommend you pick this book up right now. But it's masterful storytelling. It's eerie how much George Orwell understood about the future of our political climate. Or maybe that just has more to say about the fact that we haven't grown very much as a society. But he really just does an amazing job at imagining a very detailed world and giving what feels like a very honest representation of human behavior in such a circumstance. This story definitely holds up 75 years later. And the last book that I read in February was Beyond the Wand by Tom Felton. So Tom Felton, aka Draco Malfoy, recounts the story of his upbringing, the years leading up to, during, and after Harry Potter, and some of the struggles that he faced following the success of the franchise. I rated Beyond the Wand 3 stars. I really enjoyed Tom's storytelling. I felt he was funny and honest, making me laugh out loud at times in the way that he recounts different aspects of his upbringing, his childhood, and of course his time on the set of Harry Potter. I appreciate that he never takes himself too seriously, and when he gets to some of the more serious challenges of his lifetime, he's very raw and forthcoming with the pain and the challenges of addiction and mental illness in a way that feels very relatable and grounded. And finally, we've reached the month of March. First up, the first book that I read in March was The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. This is a fantasy historical fiction set during the time period of the Inquisition in Madrid, Spain. Luisa Cotado works as a scullion in a middle-class family home. She is gifted with certain magical abilities, which she mostly conceals, but one day her mistress discovers these gifts of hers and essentially blackmails her into exploiting her gifts to mostly elevate their social status in town. Ultimately, Luisa must work to refine her magical abilities in order to keep herself safe as she begins to gain more attention from important figures. In addition to being a threat for having magic, she must work very hard to conceal her Jewish heritage during the very threatening time of the Inquisition. I gave The Familiar 3.5 stars. I thought the magic system was really interesting, and I really enjoyed the way that Leigh Bardugo mixed in language and historical context together to contribute to the magic system. Of course, her writing is lovely, but I felt that the plot left a little bit to be desired. Like, I wanted just a little more oomph from it. The ending also felt very different in tone, like almost a different book. I enjoyed it, but there were just some inconsistencies that took a little bit away from the experience for me. This was a big month for fantasy books, but the second book that I read in the month of March was Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wong. In this story, you're following Siona, who is a very ambitious woman aspiring to be high mage in the aggressively misogynistic city of Tehran. At the beginning of the story, after a very challenging trial, she does achieve this status and becomes the first woman to become high mage. Of course, her colleagues don't make it easy for her once she joins the team. As a cruel kind of joke, she is assigned Tommel, the janitor, as her lab assistant, who has lived in Tehran for the last 10 years as a refugee after losing his entire family to what's known as the Blight. Throughout this story, we witness as Siona's own prejudice and ignorance is challenged in her partnership with Tommel as she gets to know him, as they together begin to uncover some truly devastating truths about the magic that holds up the seemingly utopic society of Tehran. This was a 5-star book for me. I still think about this book. It was such an enjoyable read. These are deeply flawed, deeply frustrating characters, but in the best way. You're getting a very raw and unfiltered perspective to a mind that has been deeply brainwashed by the system that it grew up in, that is Siona's perspective. And I would say Emma Wong doesn't really hold back. I mean, you get pretty uncomfortable and frustrated with Siona's character as you're kind of going through her processing and her understanding of the world, the way that she interacts with Tamil. But you watch her grow. Echoing a little bit of what I shared in my feelings about Bright Young Women, Emma Wong does what I love, which is she mostly lets you kind of come up with your own feelings about this story. It very much feels like you are kind of absorbing this through Siona's eyes. Ultimately, she lets you kind of come up with your own conclusions and judgments about these characters. The magic system is also really cool. Basically, imagine if the M in STEM stood for magic. That's what's going on here. It's very, very interesting, unique, and I really enjoyed it. And I mean, anything with magical typewriters, I'm in. Continuing on the fantasy train, book 3 was Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. I really enjoyed the writing style of Leigh Bardugo when I read The Familiar, and so I was excited to pick up Ninth House, which I knew was one of her more popular books. In Ninth House, Alex Stern gets a second chance at life when she gets essentially a free ticket to Yale University. Alex has the unique ability to see grays and is tasked with using her abilities to help the organization that sort of polices the secret societies of the university. When her mentor ultimately goes missing, Alex is forced to rise to the occasion and dig a little deeper into the mysteries hiding behind the true power of each of these secret societies. I gave Ninth House 5 stars. I thought this was a really unique perspective and a fresh take on the typical characters that you get in a dark academia setting. I also really appreciated the Yale lore that Leigh Bardugo mixed into her fantastical magic system. I thought the character development and the journey of the plot was very well done. I never really felt like I knew what was going to happen. I, of course, felt inclined to make predictions, but I was really immersed in the story. I wasn't super preoccupied with it. I would definitely recommend if you enjoy a good fantasy read, if you like a little bit of dark academia, if you enjoy raw, flawed characters, this is the book for you. Following Ninth House, I picked up the second book in the Alex Stern series, which was Hellbent, also by Leigh Bardugo. As the title would suggest, we are descending into hell in book 2 on a rescue mission. Alex teams up with a group of allies and is forced to face a lot of difficult challenges in order to complete her mission. I gave Hellbent 4 stars. I thought this was a pretty solid continuation of the story. I really enjoyed the opportunity to delve into more of Alex's backstory as well as some of the supporting characters' backstories, most of which were pretty dark, but again, very well done. Like is customary with the sequel, I did feel like there were times where the plot dragged just a little bit. This is rather specific, but I felt that there were some red herrings that didn't work well for me. I'm very picky with red herrings where I feel like they, of course, are there to serve as a distraction for us as an audience, but they should also still feel very relevant to the plot. Otherwise, they just feel like they were kind of randomly inserted there to distract us from figuring out the plot twist or whatever. I did not feel like the red herrings were done very well in this story. I was kind of questioning what the purpose was there, obviously beyond serving as a red herring. So that was one little thing that kind of bugged me about the story. But I did read this rather quickly because I was very excited to read it, so perhaps on a reread I might feel different. Second to last, we have Funny Story by Emily Henry. This is the one random non-fantasy book that I read in the month of March. I think I just needed kind of a little palate cleanser after so much back-to-back fantasy. In this contemporary romance, we are following Daphne and Miles as they recover from recently being dumped by their significant others, Peter and Petra, who decided to get together shortly before Daphne and Peter were meant to get married. Daphne, who is our introvert librarian, has to move in with Miles out of convenience and kind of a last-minute emergency situation. Miles is our sweet, scruffy bartender who is a bit silly as he also struggles with his grief of being broken up with by Petra. For the most part, these two avoid each other until one day they drunkenly come up with a plan to show their exes that they have moved on once they receive an invite to their wedding. So you can kind of guess where the story takes you. I gave Funny Story 4 stars. This was my first Emily Henry, and I had an absolutely great time reading it. I thought it was funny, and I really enjoyed the characters who felt pretty relatable. They felt age appropriate. I didn't feel like I was reading anything super immature. The conflicts that they experienced, both inner and in their relationship, felt appropriate for their age and never felt cheap or like they were done for the sake of the plot. Nothing like miscommunication or anything that, you know, at least I hate. Nothing like that. Overall, this was a cute and cozy story. And the last book that I read was Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. This is book 2 in the Letters of Enchantment duology. In this story, Iris Winnow is home from her time spent at the front and is trying to kind of pick up the pieces of her life after experiencing the horrors of war. I gave Ruthless Vows 2.5 stars. I really enjoyed Divine Rivals, which is book 1, and I was looking forward to Ruthless Vows and a continuation to the story of Iris and Roman. But I was really disappointed with this one. I felt like the plot just really dragged on. Like there were pages and pages of this book that I felt could have been completely deleted because a lot of it just kind of felt like a rehash of book 1. Beyond the actual like retelling of the first book, the plot itself, the story itself, felt like a copy paste of book 1. Circumstances were kind of manipulated to put us in a similar situation as like maybe the first part of book 1. That was really annoying because I wanted something maybe a little more original. So yeah, where I was maybe looking for a bit more progress in the story, it felt more of like just a lateral move using a lot of the same devices and material, and that was a bit disappointing. Okay. And those are the 20 books that I read in the first quarter of this year. Thank you so much for watching. If you stuck around for the end of this video, leave a star emoji in the comments below. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Share with your friends who you know also like to read these same types of books. I so appreciate those of you who have subscribed and who have been commenting and liking on my videos so far. It makes me so excited to continue to make more content for you guys. So until next time, I'll see you next time. Bye!